I own a small piece of land in a very rural part of upstate New York. I use it for hunting and as a quiet place to escape the everyday life in the city. My property lacks electricity and running water, so my family, my wife and 2 kids, and I can only stay overnight in our travel trailer or by tent camping. In September of 2017, we were staying at my property when something happened that has changed us forever. It was around midnight when something woke us all up, except for our oldest son, who slept through everything. He's always been a heavy sleeper. At first, I thought maybe an animal had knocked over some stuff outside because we could hear noises coming from that direction. I went out and shined my flashlight around, but couldn't see anything unusual. So I just figured it was nothing and went back inside the camper where everyone was waiting. A few minutes later, whatever made those noises started making them again, this time louder. We heard footsteps crunching on dry leaves as well as twigs snapping under weight. It sounded like someone big was walking towards us. The sound came closer until it eventually stopped right next to where we were camped out, less than 20 feet away from our door. Whatever it was stayed there for several minutes while we all sat frozen in fear, wondering what would happen next. Then, suddenly, without warning, it screamed at us. It let out a blood-curdling scream that sent chills down your spine. Even thinking about it now gives me goosebumps. It wasn't human-like, nor did any other animal make sounds similar enough for comparison purposes. It literally scared the living daylights out of all of us. I grabbed my shotgun, which I keep loaded by the bedside table just in case any critters come too close during hunting season. However, I didn't fire off any shots because whatever it was that screamed at us never came close enough for me to see. I thought maybe this creature had moved away after making such a loud noise. But then, the sounds of twigs snapping and leaves crunching started again, as if something were walking around out there. I tried looking outside with my flashlight once more, but couldn't see anything. So we decided to wait it out until morning light broke through before doing anything else. We didn't sleep well that night though. Instead, we just stayed awake inside our camper, holding onto each other tightly while waiting for dawn's arrival. When the first light appeared, we all went outside together, armed with weapons. I carried my shotgun and began searching around the campsite, hoping to find any clues as to what might have happened last night. I noticed several strange things that morning. For example, there were huge footprints on the ground leading towards and away from our camper. The prints were too big to be human. I wear size 12 boots, but they didn't look like any animal print I've ever seen either. They had long toes with sharp claws sticking out of them. The depth of these tracks was over an inch deep in the dirt and mud. We also noticed some very large branches broken off trees nearby, as if something very heavy had pushed them down while passing through the forest. One tree even looked like it had been snapped in half at the base. My wife suggested maybe a bear or moose came by during the night, which would explain why we heard noises earlier. But then we remembered how this thing screamed at us. Whatever it wasn't your typical woodland creature. As the day went on, we decided not to tell anyone about what happened because, honestly, who would believe such a story? Instead, we just tried forgetting about the whole ordeal, hoping never to encounter it again. I'm not really sure what happened that night or what kind of creature it was. I've never seen anything like it before and don't want to ever see it again. A few months later, in early 2018, I found a trail camera on sale at my local hunting store, so I decided to buy one for my property, thinking maybe if something were out there again, I could get evidence this time around. Unfortunately, nothing happened all spring and summer. Even deer sightings were scarce during bow season. It wasn't until October rolled around when things got weird once more. It was about 2 weeks into the month when our family went camping again, this time with the trailer. We set up camp near where the previous incident took place, but further back from the road, just in case whatever came by last year returned while we slept. We wanted to give ourselves a little extra protection distance-wise between us and the unknown creatures. The first week of our stay was uneventful as far as animal activity goes. However, late one evening towards the end of the second week, everything changed. We heard some noises coming from the woods behind us, the same direction where we had previously encountered something. The sounds started off quiet, then grew louder over the course of the next hour or so, eventually turning into full-blown screams, much like those heard during the prior event. My wife grabbed her shotgun while our oldest son handed me mine. I still kept them loaded after all. We both checked the chambers before heading outside together, ready to defend ourselves if needed. When we stepped out of the camper, we saw a large, shadowy figure standing not too far away. We couldn't make out exact details due to the darkness surrounding the area, but the silhouette appeared humanoid in shape with long arms hanging down its sides, reaching its knees, possibly lower. I pointed my flashlight towards the thing, hoping to illuminate it better, but it only seemed to growl louder in return. The light beam died almost instantly, leaving us once more in darkness, except for the faint glow of moonlight reflecting off the fallen leaves on the ground. Whatever stood nearby let loose another scream, making the hair stand on the back of our necks and sending shivers through the spines of every family member present at that moment. We were all scared, but didn't want to show too much fear because we knew this creature sensed that and could attack us at any moment. I slowly began backing away towards the camper while keeping my eyes fixed on whatever stood there. My wife did the same thing while our oldest son aimed his shotgun in the direction, trying to get a better look at what we were dealing with. Suddenly, another scream rang out, which startled both boys, causing them to drop their weapons onto the ground before running inside the trailer and slamming the door behind them. My wife quickly followed suit, leaving me outside alone, facing the unknown being lurking in the shadows. I must admit, I was very frightened, especially since I only had a flashlight in hand to defend myself. However, I kept as cool and focused as best I could, given the situation unfolding around me. The figure standing there never moved an inch throughout the entire ordeal. It just stared back at me, not making a single sound. The screams stopped once my family went inside the camper, so everything became silent again, except for the occasional rustling noises heard coming from the nearby woods. It seemed like something else might have been moving around out there. After about half an hour or so, I decided to go indoors myself and join the rest of my family, feeling a little more comfortable knowing they were safe within the walls of our temporary home away from home. We stayed awake most of the night, discussing what had happened earlier, going over the details of the events, and recalling every last detail possible. Eventually, exhaustion set in, forcing sleep upon us all. We eventually drifted off into slumberland, where no harm would come to reach us anymore. Hopefully, when morning came, we inspected the area surrounding the campsite, looking for evidence of anything unusual. But we found nothing out of the ordinary aside from broken branches and tree limbs scattered on the ground here and there, along with several footprints near where the creature had been seen standing the previous night. The prints looked fresh, though it was hard to determine the exact size and shape due to the wet and muddy conditions. We couldn't tell if they belonged to an animal or a human. They definitely weren't bear tracks, based on the length and width measurements taken using a tape measure later back at the cabin. We decided not to stay another night at that location and moved further down the road about a mile away. We spent the rest of our vacation there without any other strange incidents. We never told anyone else what happened for fear of being ridiculed or worse, so we kept it to ourselves until now. I still go up there every year, but have yet to experience anything similar since then, thankfully. I don't know what kind of creature we encountered those 2 nights back in 2017, but whatever it was, it definitely changed my outlook on things. Back in the early 2000s, I was part of a small group that hunted on private property with permission in upstate New York. This particular piece of land was a large farm with some abandoned fields, woods, and marshy areas, as well as an old farmhouse at the top of one hill. The house had been empty for many years, but it still had furniture inside from when it was last occupied. Myself and my hunting buddies would often go into this house to get out of the weather or have lunch during deer season. One day, while sitting outside eating our lunch, we noticed movement through one window on the second floor. There appeared to be something moving around inside. However, because there were no floors left upstairs, we couldn't see below the waistline what was moving about. When we finished eating, my friend and I went up onto the porch, which faced where we saw movement upstairs. He could look through his scope while I watched from below with binoculars. After some time of watching the window, I saw a man-like figure moving back and forth in front of the window. I had my friend with his scope zoom in on it to see if he could get a better look. What we both saw was a large, hairy, bipedal creature about 6 feet tall, walking upright from one side of the room to another and looking out the broken glass windows as if it were observing us outside. We immediately left and have never returned to that property since that day. It wasn't until several years later that I began to put the pieces together. What we saw in that house was a Sasquatch without question. I am 54 years old and have been hunting my entire life and have never seen anything like what we witnessed that day. I am certain of one thing: it was not a man or any other animal native to New York State. I have been trying for some time now to find someone who can explain what we saw, but no one has ever gotten back to me on this subject before you guys contacted me. There are many things that lead me to believe it was a Sasquatch. The first thing is, it was not a bear. There were no other animals living in the house or anywhere near there, and bears do not walk upright like we saw. The second reason I think it was a Bigfoot is because of how much time this creature spent looking out at us through the windows on the top floor. It watched us for several minutes while walking back and forth across what used to be floors up there, but now only had broken boards left. It did not seem aggressive toward us in any way, and never made any attempt to come downstairs where we were or leave by another exit. When my friend looked at him through his scope, he said, "I am going home," and immediately went back to his truck without saying anything else, until later when he called me from home after leaving our hunting area. This is all I can remember about that day. As far as seeing this animal, I can tell you that we never saw this creature again. The following year, our group stopped hunting there as the owner of the property sold it to someone else. That was about 18 years ago, and I haven't been back since then. I'm not sure if this is a glitch in the Matrix or what, but I will try to explain it the best I can. Back when my wife and I first started dating, we were at a local bar with friends, having drinks and dancing, among other things. Well, about 2 hours into being there, one of our favorite songs came on. By now, my wife and I had been together for over 5 years. We were both excited, so we decided to get up and dance. Out of nowhere, an older man came walking towards us while holding his drink. My wife noticed him coming from behind me, so she stepped back toward me to avoid being bumped. He bumped me pretty hard as he walked past, but didn't spill his drink on either one of us, which was impressive since he was obviously intoxicated. As soon as he got past us, he did something that blew my mind. He disappeared right before our eyes, literally vanished. 1 second he was there, the next second he was gone. My wife and I just looked at each other, wondering what had just happened. We were both completely sober and have never had any issues with drugs or anything, so it's not like we were under the influence. We walked around looking for him because we thought maybe he got knocked down by someone, but no, he was nowhere to be found. It wasn't a big place either. He couldn't have gotten far that quickly, especially since he could barely walk without tripping over himself due to his level of intoxication. I'm convinced that this man somehow teleported from one spot in time to another right before our eyes. There is no way humanly possible that anyone could disappear as quickly as this guy did, unless they are using some sort of teleportation device or wormhole, which doesn't exist. So, who knows? Maybe wormholes do exist, but only open up randomly when certain conditions are met. If you can provide any insight or explanation as to what happened, I would love to hear it because this has bothered me for over 10 years. and still bothers me to this day. Also, we have never been able to find that man. We asked around, but no one seemed to know who he was either, so that made the situation even stranger. This happened to me in 2003, and I was only able to tell a few people about it because it sounds so crazy. I'm not even sure if I believe what happened myself. I lived on a rural property at the time in upstate New York. The closest neighbor was about a mile away through the woods. One day, while outside with my dog, we saw something really weird by our shed, which had been empty for years since moving there. It looked like some sort of small wooden doll that would move around whenever we weren't looking directly at it. This thing freaked us out so much that we didn't want to go near or touch it at all. After a while, though, curiosity got the better of us. One night, we finally went over there together, armed with flashlights, cameras, and cell phones, ready just in case anything weird started happening again. But nothing did. It seemed completely normal now, so we took it back to our house and placed it on a shelf in my bedroom. The next morning, I woke up to find the doll sitting upright on my bed with its arms crossed. This was really strange because there's no way that it could have gotten there by itself, especially since nobody else had been home all night. I immediately called over some friends who were into supernatural stuff too, so they could see what happened for themselves, but nothing weird happened while they were there either. Later that day, my friend called me to say that she had been having some really weird dreams lately about a wooden doll moving around in her house. She also mentioned seeing strange symbols on the walls and ceilings, which made no sense at all because there was no way for anyone to have gotten into her place without leaving any evidence behind. Plus, it seemed unlikely that someone would break in just to mess with us. I started getting freaked out again after hearing this, so we decided it would be best if we got rid of the doll as soon as possible. We took it back outside and burned it while chanting some random words from an old book my friend had. It's hard to describe exactly what happened next, but things got pretty intense. First off, everything went dark except for the fire, which seemed brighter than ever before. Then, there was this loud banging noise coming from inside our shed, followed by a high-pitched screeching sound similar to nails being dragged across a chalkboard or a really bad violin being played at full volume. We were both pretty scared by this point, so we quickly threw the doll into the fire and watched as it started melting away before our eyes while still making those horrible noises. The next day, I went back to check on the shed, but there was no sign of anything strange having happened there whatsoever. There was no burnt ground or smell either. My friend also said that she hadn't had any more weird dreams since we burned the doll, so it seemed like everything was finally back to normal again, or so I thought. One night, while I was sleeping, my bedroom door suddenly flew open, and the lights turned on all by themselves. I woke up immediately and saw a tall, dark figure standing in front of me. It looked like some sort of shadowy man with long hair and glowing red eyes, which made it seem even more terrifying than before. I quickly grabbed my phone to call 911, but as soon as I did, this thing started screaming at me in what sounded like a mixture between Latin and ancient Egyptian. The words were so loud that they shook the entire house, making everything vibrate, including my bed where I was still lying down, paralyzed with fear. The next thing I remember is waking up again several hours later, feeling extremely exhausted. When I went downstairs to tell my mom what happened, she was already awake and seemed really worried about something. She told me that she had heard some sort of loud banging noise coming from inside our shed during the night, which sounded like someone trying to break in or something. I didn't want her to think I was crazy, so I just said it must have been an animal instead. Since we live out in the country where there's all sorts of wildlife around anyway, we decided not to call the police because whatever it was had already left by now, and we didn't want them thinking we were crazy either. The following night, I was too scared to sleep in my own room, so I decided to stay up all night watching TV instead. At around 2 a.m. though, something weird happened. A show about paranormal activity came on, which seemed really interesting at first, until it started showing footage from inside someone's house where they had captured what looked like some sort of shadowy figure moving around. I immediately recognized this thing as being the same one that had been haunting me recently and got extremely freaked out again. There was no way this could be just a coincidence either, since I don't even watch TV very often, especially not at 2 a.m. So there must have been some sort of supernatural force behind it all, somehow. A few days later, while outside with my dog again, we heard another strange noise coming from our shed. This time, though, it sounded more like an animal than anything else, so we went over there together, armed with flashlights, ready for whatever might happen next. But again, nothing did. The shed was completely empty, just like before, and there were no signs of anything strange having happened either. After thinking about it for a while, I realized that maybe the doll we had burned wasn't really evil at all, but instead some sort of protective spirit which had been trying to help us by warding off whatever negative energy might have been in our house. I don't know if this is true or not though, because nobody else has ever experienced anything weird around here since then, so maybe it's just my imagination playing tricks on me after all. When I first read this, it sounded like a pretty crazy story to me too, and even now that I've written it all down here in detail, parts of the whole experience still seem kind of unbelievable. However, there's no denying what happened because everything I've described above is 100% true. I can't say for sure what really went on during those few weeks, but one thing is certain, something weird definitely did happen, which was beyond our control and understanding at the time. It would be great if someone could help explain any of this, or provide some insight into how these events might have been connected together somehow. I was a delivery driver for one of the local auto parts stores. I had been driving to Vermont almost every day for about 2 months before this incident occurred. I always returned back home late at night after finishing my route. One particular night, around 11 p.m., I got lost on my way back from delivering in Vermont. So I pulled over on a dirt road to check Google Maps on my phone. After finding out where I was supposed to go, I started up the truck again and put it into gear. Suddenly, there were these very bright lights behind me. My first thought was that someone had come flying down the road so fast that they almost hit me. However, when I looked in the rearview mirror, nothing seemed odd about them, except how blindingly bright they were. So I just sat there, trying to figure out what could be going on. No cars were coming down the road in either direction. Suddenly, everything got really quiet, and I noticed that the lights were getting bigger and brighter. I put the truck in gear and stepped on the gas to get away from whatever was coming at me. I drove maybe 100 yards or so until suddenly everything went black, and then I wasn't moving anymore. It was as if I had been frozen in place while driving, but there were no skid marks anywhere on the road in either direction. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust after losing sight of those bright lights. When they did, all I could see was this really tall figure, at least 8 feet, standing next to my truck. He was staring at me with these piercing blue eyes, which seemed even more intense because he was completely hairless everywhere except his head. His head had long, grayish white hair down past his shoulders that almost glowed with its own light, as if he were some kind of angel or something. His skin looked very smooth, almost like porcelain, especially around his face. It appeared as though there might have been some kind of light source underneath his skin, which gave him that glowing effect. His facial features were very defined and sharp-looking too, especially around his cheekbones, which were high up on his face. It looked like he had no nose at all when you first saw him from the front. The other thing I noticed was how thin he appeared to be, as if there were barely any muscle mass under that skin of his. Everything seemed flat or sunken in places where most people would have curves or bumps like a normal human being might have. He just stood there, staring at me with those eyes for what felt like forever before turning away without saying anything. He walked off into the woods behind my truck until I couldn't see him anymore. Even then, I could still feel someone watching me from the darkness. I got out of my truck and started yelling for him to come back, but there was no response. So I just sat in my truck until the sun came up before driving home as fast as possible without looking back. I didn't want to see that figure again. The next day, when I went into work, everyone was asking where I had been all night and what had happened to me. It seemed like they were worried about me, but when I told them everything, they just laughed at first. Then they looked really serious before telling me not to talk about this with anyone else ever again. They said it was just a dream or something and that I needed to see a doctor about my mental health before coming back to work again. After hearing all of this, I decided maybe they were right, so I quit my job and moved away from there as fast as possible. I didn't want anyone else finding out what had happened either. It took me a long time to find another job because every time I applied somewhere, they would call my previous employer. Then I wouldn't get hired for some reason or another. It seemed like nobody wanted anything to do with me anymore. Anyway, that's my story.